Oh, you're recording it.
Yeah, well, because you never know when we're going to say something good. Q&A number 2.
Okay, without Christian.
Without Christian, unfortunate. He'll be back for another one, I'm sure. We'll have something else to talk about. We're going to go through some of the steps of PID tuning, I guess, using the PIDtoolbox step response tool. We should at least start off with a couple of the things that you might want to do to do these tests.
Yeah, the precursors
for right?
making good logs.
Exactly. So the first thing was we were talking about this idea of basement tuning because it's something that I've been doing for quite a while. It's a real pain to have to go out in the field every time and make these long flights. And I wanted to know what the minimum amount was necessary in order to actually get useful information from the quad. Mm-hmm. Because I'm stuck in the house sometimes with kids and everything, and I don't get out to fly very often, I started to come up with ways that I could just do this. I'm just going to show a little bit of this video. So this is an example of what I would do.
Okay, so
I'm just trying to
pitch and roll a little bit.
I'm trying not to hit the walls, basically. That's about it. Just trying not to hit the walls, and I count to 10 or 15 seconds. That's about it.
Okay, 10-15 seconds is sufficient.
It's surprisingly sufficient. So this is the thing, right? And I'll show you the results, and I'll show you actually I'll show you a video after. Remind me of this as well, but I'll show you a video where I did like really small gradual movements, and in the same log file, then I did that for about 20 seconds, and then I kicked in with these harsher movements, and I want to show you that the results are the same, and then I want to describe why I think that they're the same, and why it doesn't matter up to a certain point. If you just ask me that question again, so that it's on, I can cut it later.
So at the end, you don't need a lot of snappy pitch roll, yaw movements, and
right.
All you need is a couple of hovering with yaw and no, not yaw, pitch and roll.
Well, if you can get yaw movements in there as well, but it's a little more difficult. But the main PD balance tuning is done with your pitch and roll anyway. So you can go a long ways by just getting that down. But yeah, you don't need really snappy movements. It's surprising because I think what happens is the system is mostly linear up to a point. So the system becomes more non-linear when you inject really strong movements, like you start rotating at, say, 700 or 800 degrees a second. In that case, this might not be representative, but it's still going to be pretty close. And what I want to do is I want to do a tune like this, or at least you to do a tune like this, and then take it out in the field, and then let's try like these big full movements and all that, and then see how it actually generalizes. Because I'm pretty confident that it generalizes pretty well, and I've done this several times now.
Okay.
On many different rigs.
Because in the past, what I tried to get as many samples as possible. So like 4.5 minutes. That's about the log size. Then the log is full, 8 megabyte. So this is not actually it's not really required.
It's not really necessary because it's as long as, so in the case of the software, you can always set I'm getting ahead of myself, but you can set the subsampling to a higher level, and it'll sample it at much finer resolution. So it'll take every bit of data that it can out of it, extract every bit of data that it can out of the log file, and it doesn't take much. I've shown you now, you've seen several videos where I've showed you, for example, the window moving along, and you can see the step response plotted only within that window. And using only the data within that window, it's sufficient to produce a reliable step response. Now, in terms of log rate, you also don't need to log at a really high rate. So, because a lot of times when you're doing multiple tests like this, you'll fill up like your flash drive on your flight controller really fast.
So we don't need a high log frequency rate. One kilohertz is sufficient, I think.
It's sufficient.
And we don't need any debug.
We don't really need to debug, no. But
okay.
I mean, if you're out in the field anyway, 1 kilohertz will probably be fine for almost everything, even your noise profile. But if you really want like we discussed before, mainly you want to go higher log rates to get better estimates of the latency. But I may find a workaround for that, like in future revisions of PIDtoolbox. I'm going to see there's different ways that I could be measuring latency. So there's going to be ways that I'm going to optimize this to be a little bit better and faster.
So what I did, I tried to stay on one axis as good as possible, so not mix the axis. I'm not sure if that's necessary or not.
It's not.
At first I tried to do just rolls, then small rolls, then small pitches, and then some small yaw turns.
That's probably okay to do, but then you have a period of the log file where there's nothing going into it. So
maybe mixing is even better.
If it's possible to mix it all at the same time, probably it's better. The next thing is the other settings like feed forward and demin. So generally, in the past, I used to say it doesn't matter, and you could just leave feed forward as is. But I think if we're really testing, if we really want to know the P to D ratio, the optimal P to D ratio, and the optimal gains of the system without any extra inputs like that, we're best off turning them as low as possible. So things like feed forward and demin. Demin is a problem because it makes D dynamic. And if D is dynamic, then it's going to depend on the amount of stick input. You're really injecting a non-linearity into what we're assuming is a linear system. And this method that I'm using is really truly a linear method. Remember, everything about the PID controller is linear.
So for the test, switch off demin.
I would switch off demin because you have no idea what the real D is that you're using then.
And pull the slider for FF, feed forward, to I think 0.5 is the minimum. Or switch it off to 0, because then you'll lose the slider functionality if you override it as zeros.
But you can also take the transition value and put it at 1.0. So by taking the feed forward transition and setting it to 1, it means that you're really reducing the feed forward effect at the small center stick movements. So those two things to start, and just turn demin off.
Combine it both.
Combine it both. Yeah, and turn demin off. That's the best approach.
I just, for the test, I just switched it to the slider all the way to the left.
It's fine. Okay, and what have I got here? I said, why is because you want to get the step response to the basic, you want to get step response results to the basic PID control settings to get the true PD balance. Feed forward will often produce a bit of overshoot, and you won't be able to tell whether this is due to like too much P or not enough D, or whether it's feed forward doing it, right? So you got to pull feed forward out of the equation.
If I switch on FF later, it should, I think P should be reduced along.
Well, let's hang on a second. So feed forward later will result in more overshoot, but not necessarily more bounce back. And most importantly is you won't get an oscillatory related bounce back that you get from too much P or not enough D. So it'll just be a little bump in the initial part of the step response. And that usually doesn't show up in any bounce back or anything in HD video. So generally feed forward is just going to give you that shorter latency, which is what you're really after.
Okay, but it looks like an overshoot in the graph.
Yeah.
It is, probably. But you can't see it in the video.
Whenever the output surpasses the input, that's overshoot. So this is just an example that illustrates how to look for overshoot in the traces. So in this example, the set point is the red trace, and it's slowly commanding rightward roll movement. Near the top, it's just pushed a bit faster, and then it returns back to center stick. The black is the gyro, what the copter is actually doing, and these arrows point to moments of overshoot. So you can see that wherever the gyro gets ahead of set point in the direction that set point is moving is overshoot. So at points where the black trace is above the red trace in this direction, and at points where the black trace is below the red trace in this direction. So this is slightly different from what we call bounce back, which is a special case of overshoot after we center the stick following snap rolls or flips. Okay, so we have a log file loaded. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the step response tool. Boom. If we wanted, we could adjust these inputs to only look at a certain segment of data. That's this gray areas again. And you use this here to select the window of usable data. All right, so what do we do here? We got run, save fig. We've got a drop down for subsampling. Again, all this does is going to set the fineness of. it's going to help you get more data when you don't have much data. So if you only have a 20-second log file, you'd probably want to put this up to a higher value, but it's going to be slower the higher the subsampling. That's all you need to know. This just means I'm going to look at data from 40 to 500 degrees per second, because we don't generally want it to look at stuff that's too small. You don't want it to be looking at every little jitter in the stick. That's not really input. So we're setting it, say, between 40 and 500 degrees per second, and that's what the main plots will do when I run this. And then when I hit snap maneuvers, or in the new version it's labeled something else, it's just saying that give me the data that's above this value. So we're just going to hit run with the default. Chug.
Oh, it's fast. See?
So
it's a lot faster now, because you complained about my 4.5 minute logs, which took forever. It's very fast.
You wait till you see the latest one. It's going to be a lot better than that. So you can see already here what you're doing is you just your P gain is 42, your D gain is 15, and here your P is 42 and your D is 21. So the point here is that this system, this algorithm is super sensitive. It's way more sensitive than you're going to be able to detect in the traces. And this is why it's so valuable, even in your basement tune. The fact that you just hovering around, doing a couple little twitch movements back and forth, and you can get this reliable difference in the magnitude of these responses, right?
I can see it's a sample rate of around 100, so that doesn't really make a huge difference between the log files I created with 5 minutes of log time with snappy movements.
Exactly. Right.
Interesting.
Okay, so there you go. Now we've got a representation. Now let's look at a lot of data. So this is actually the same kind of tool. It's the same tool basically, but I'm working on making it a new version of this tool, and so it'll be able to output overlaid step responses. This is actually really cool, because I can if I show you, like, you can actually run this by just grabbing like your 5 or 6 log files, hitting go, and like 20 seconds later it plots up all these curves. So this is just showing you the effect of P term on the step response. So again, these are just little 20-second flights, and I did a series of them. And in this case, you can see I'm just increasing P from 10 to 20 to 30, 40, 50, 60.
Okay, so it's manual.
I and D are fixed. D min's off. F is as low as it'll go with the slider. Okay? So when P is like 10, which is ridiculous, you wouldn't do that. You can see you get this really slow onset, and you get this oscillation. In fact, if I were to stretch this out and you can look at it, this oscillation goes on and on and on. And in fact, this is the classic low P-term effect. Have you ever seen guys with the older quadcopters, or have you looked at any kind of PID tuning back in, say, pre-2017 or 2016? You'd see guys showing you this thing wobbling around. So you give it a little stick input and it does this. We're looking at here about 3 hertz or something, right? And you can see with the P gain really low, it's very slow getting to 1, and then it overshoots, and then it wobbles back and forth and back and forth. And what's interesting, you notice D gain's pretty high here. In fact, in relative terms, it's really high compared to P. So adding more D is not going to help this. And sometimes people get this sort of overshoot, and the first thing they think is, oh, maybe I need to turn my D gain up. Now, obviously, this is an extreme case here. This is P of 10. But like, let's go to, say, P of like 30 or 40. In 40, you can still see the yellow curve is still slightly above there. And one might think if I just add more D here, that would get rid of that. It might to a certain degree, but part of this is still this loose signal, right? That's kind of because the copter just doesn't have enough P gain to take care of it.
It's not snappy at all.
Let's look at the peak responses here too. You notice the peaks here. The peak here is around 1.6. Peak here is 1.36. And 1.2. It's still overshooting here, 1.12, right? But look at the time of those peaks. It's 124 milliseconds. And as I start to increase P, you can see that the time of that peak is slowly coming in. It's getting, peak is coming into here, right? So now let's go to D. What do we see here? So in this case now I have my P gain fairly high, and I'm starting with very low D gains. So one thing you notice right away, you can get this oscillation, but look how much faster it is, right? Because now your P gain is really driving this. and the D, this is a more of a true sign that D, you don't have enough D, right? Not this case. So sometimes it's a little difficult to tell what case you're in, what condition you're at, but I'll show you why I suggest tuning PD gain before PD ratio soon, based
That's
on
one interesting thing. I noticed the frequency is kind of the same. It's the amplitude that changes.
It's just the amplitude, exactly. So you look at the peak is actually getting smaller, but the timing is pretty much steady at about 30 or 40. And the only thing that would make this time, this latency become faster would be to crank the P gain up. So the P or feed forward. P or feed forward would bring that peak over. But that's usually a good indicator of this is the result of too low D. Whereas in this case, you can see the peaks are changing.
Yeah, the frequency changes down.
Right, as you start to add more P. So this is, So now let's go to the PD balance, PD gain example. Okay, here we are at a gain of PD gain of 0.6, and that's this dark brown curve, okay? And what you notice is that there's some overshoot here. And now as I start to increase the PD gain, the 0.081, you notice that overshoot start to come down. As I move. What's interesting here is the P to D ratio is the same. I'm not adding any extra D here. So this is a sure indicator. This is a good, clear indicator that really the reason why we're getting overshoot here is not because we didn't have enough D, but because we didn't have enough P. And so, because with low P, when you start to make some big movements, you're building up a lot of error. And if the copter can't respond fast enough with low P, then it's going to produce this fairly low frequency, sort of low oscillation. And again, that peak is shorter than you'd expect. So that's a good indicator too. You can see that the peak time, not as slow as I showed you earlier, because that was a ridiculously low P value. But nonetheless, we're in the realm now of the Betaflight settings, right? And so you can see that peak time is slowly shrinking. You see that? 37. This one jumped up. It's a little bit odd here, but probably the green one, 37 is reliable. It's probably just a bad data.
Yeah, there's not really a peak in the blue one. That's probably why.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't really calculate the...
Well, it could have picked it off a little bit later. That's actually what's happening too, because what happens is, once you get down where the signal is really nicely reads 1 and doesn't overshoot much, then it's going to it could grab a peak out here somewhere, wherever, The best thing is to look at this. So 14, 15. So we're pretty much close to the fastest response we're going to get here. So I would probably pick as the proper P to D gain for roll to be one of these guys. But what's interesting, right, is that I didn't even touch the P to D ratio yet. Because I think if you go to the PD ratio first, you could make the wrong assumption that you need something like down here. So imagine if I chose this. Now I've got my P gain is 42 and my D gain is 42. That's the green guy. That seems to be, or maybe even the blue is probably close. But you can see it's still overshooting. It's got that slow overshoot. Its peak is still 1.1 or so, right? So this is why I wanted to pull away from the idea of saying that people should start by tuning the P to D balance, because if you don't have the gain high enough, you're going to sometimes get these low overshoots here, and people are going to think, well, what should I add? If I got overshoot, I should add D, right? That's the general assumption in the field, and they're going to make a mistake there. If instead you start with your gains, you're going to already see in some cases that by just cranking the gain, you'll start to see this peak going down. Now, if you don't, if this peak doesn't go down with gain, then maybe your gains were already probably good and you should go to P. But this is the place to start.
From this analysis, what PD gain would you choose to go into the next test?
I would probably choose the 1.6 or 1.4, the green or the blue.
Okay.
And you'll notice that it's still not really enough for pitch. It's nice. Betaflight 4.3 is coming out. Actually, you can get this stuff now, but it's going to have a roll to pitch ratio slider, because the standard roll to pitch ratio is typically not appropriate for a lot of frames. a lot of freestyle frames that have a lot more weight distributed across the pitch axis. And you can see that here, that you got quite a bit more sort of slow movement going on here. There's that oscillation again. And you can see that it doesn't really, it's pretty close with the blue, 74. But I think you could even push this a little farther. I would probably a little bit farther. And in future versions of this software, when I get this out and people are able to use this to be able to analyze that, then there'll also be an option where you could, well, you probably don't need to overlay pitch.
Could you go even further? You stopped at 1.6, maybe 1.8, 2.0?
I wouldn't, because I think you've reached a point where your latency is already sort of reaching its fastest point.
Diminishing, yeah.
Right, so it's a point of diminishing returns in terms of latency there.
So that's the point where to stop.
I think so, yeah. And
what about the D-term oscillations? I think we had this a while ago.
You're absolutely right. You have to then at some point, you get these settings, you have to revisit your filtering and probably take a quick glance and make sure that you're not, causing any kind of oscillations by cranking that P to D gain too high. But
okay, so you can't go forever. For first, it doesn't make sense because you get diminishing latency results, so it doesn't make sense to go further. And there's a risk that you get, I don't know how would you call it then. When D is too high, you get some issues.
First, it's not optimal if you have to go and sacrifice an optimal tune because of some kind of problem with a frame or because of some kind of feedback or the flight controller is not properly mounted or something like that, right? It sucks.
You shouldn't get too many oscillations anyway if the filter tuning was done right. Unless you have a different issue.
If you're getting D-term oscillation, is it because you're at the proper or you're above the proper P and D settings? Are you getting the oscillation because your P and D gain is too high? Well, not according to the step response. So if the step response is telling you that your P and D gain is perfect, but you're getting some D oscillation, then you have an issue that you have to deal with. You're either saying, okay, I'll compromise and I'll turn my PD gain down, even though it's not going to be good for the step response. I'll turn it down just so that I don't get oscillation. Is that really a solution? It's a kind of a band-aid solution.
Yeah, but that's the thing, because if you get D-term oscillations, the recommendation is to increase filtering to get less noise into the pit loop, and reduce the D-term oscillations.
That will work if the D-term oscillation is above 100 hertz. But if by D-term oscillation we're talking about something that's oscillating down in 40 hertz, more filtering won't make it better. More filtering makes it worse.
I think this part of our discussion is where Mark says, check out that, how did he say, knowledge drop.
Exactly.
We are looking at noise at 40 hertz, around 40 hertz.
We're looking at a changing in the gyro filter sliders. This is the gyro filter slider at 0.5, 0.75, 1. This is where I'm just doing straight cruising with a full throttle sweep.
Okay, that's why I saw it.
Yeah, you did the same test, but this is
I think I saw this graph, so sorry.
And it'd be nice if I actually had a scale, but you can see the peak is 2.5 here, peak is 1.48, 0.8, 0.4, 0.49, 0.2.
So you actually reduced gyro filtering from 0.5 until you switched it completely off.
Right. Now this is gyro, but again, the D term is derived from the gyro. So the D term would be doing this too. I just don't have the plot to pull up for you. But if I had a plot to show you right now, D term, then with the low filtering, you'd see this would be called D term oscillation, because this would be a perfect sine wave at about 40 hertz at 50% throttle.
But why can't it be prop wash? Why do you?
Because it's straightforward flight. If you increase the filtering, you're also going to increase the probability of prop wash. But prop wash is a special case where you intentionally lower the copter down in turbulent air. It doesn't matter though. At the end of the day, this is a response of the system that probably would result in more prop wash in this case as well, and less here, okay?
So it could be thought the same way, reducing filtering, but for a different cause, because reducing delay will improve prop wash handling.
Right. Well, reducing delay is also improving this oscillation. It's just that people probably are less aware of the fact that there's this oscillation that can occur just from more filtering. In fact, this could be partly what's contributing to what people see in that jitter when there's forward flight jitter, forward flight, horizon bobble, or whatever you want to call it. This could be closely related to that. So yes, if I turn down the P to D gain, this would also reduce this. That's true. But is that the best solution? Or is it better to get your PIDs tuned properly and then deal with this with filtering? Now, obviously, at some point, you can't turn down the filtering more. You're going to have a lot of noise that goes. If you had a noisy copter, you can't do this. So if you got a noisy copter, maybe you got to stick with it somewhere around here. And in that case, then you have to turn down your PD gain. But if you don't have to turn down your PD gain, the best option is to try to do this.
What I'm wondering is, why are the devs implementing such high filtering in first place, if it's actually not a good thing up to a certain point?
Well, if you've got a really bad copter, a really bad build, they're assuming that, the average build is probably pretty crappy. The defaults are designed around the concept of the average, or the average sort of build. And so if you assume that the average is pretty crappy, then you're going to set everything in a safe zone. You're going to set your defaults so that the P and D gains are really not too high, not too low.
But actually, with sliders at 1, I think almost nobody can fly. It's not flying well at all.
Maybe with 6S, it's probably okay. I tested defaults at Emu and Betaflight at least a few months ago, and by default, Emu has less filter latency. So that might be in part what explains why Emu might fly better for some people right off the bench, right?
Yeah.
And
definitely.
also maybe their the default PIDs are probably a little more suited for more people, or maybe they're not suited for more people. Maybe it's just the people who use it find it good, and then they report back and say it's good. The happy Betaflight flyers probably just don't say anything.
When I first tried Emu Flight, it was like Kiss, almost like Kills. So Kiss was like plug and play.
Yeah.
I built the quad, flew it, was fine. There wasn't almost no tuning at all. Emu Flight was very close, a little bit of tuning, and Betaflight is a lot of tuning. But once Betaflight is flying well, it's, in my opinion, flying best in comparison.
A few things I'd like to add here before closing. We haven't talked about anything with respect to I-term tuning. So this might be something that we'll look at in a possible future video. PIDtoolbox 0.4 is coming, so you'll be able to do the multi-step trace overlay with that, multiple log processing, etc. But this two-step basement tuning thing can be done still with your current version of PIDtoolbox. And of course, there's some remaining unknowns, like is the PD tune using PIDtoolbox optimized for prop wash? Well, we don't know for sure. Probably for those seeking superb prop wash handling, some fine-tuning of PD gains and filters might be necessary. So stay tuned for all this stuff, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button.